Well, good morning. My name is Shreya. I work as a technical product manager at Expedia, and that's my email in case you want to reach out to me. So, today we're going to talk about how we are going to find a single needle from a haystack. What is the needle? What is the haystack? Let's find out as we go through the presentation. So let's start with the basic questions, the who, the why, the what, the how, and then let's dive into the meat. Okay, so who are we? We are a group of engineers who work at Expedia and help bring Expedia's mission of bringing the whole world within reach through using technology. So why did the problem of this complex problem of finding a needle in a haystack even begin? It all started in 1960s when the mainframes came, and then we had some cons in that. So then we went on to the client server, there were two end services, and then now we're in the microservice era. So there are a lot of pros to microservice architecture. Of course, we're all aware of it. It helps us break down a big problem into smaller, digestible, workable chunks, and then rather than working on this mammoth of a thing, you have smaller things to focus on. So yes, all that is great. So pretty much when, say, one request or one action happens, it goes through n number of microservices. Say, for example, an Expedia consumer comes on the browser, searches, wants to go to Costa Rica. Things can go to the cloud, to one database, two database, service 1, service 2, service 3. Sometimes we have over 200 microservices being used in a single request. So this brings us to the con of microservice architecture. Pretty much anytime anything breaks in such an architecture, it becomes really time consuming, it becomes really difficult, and it's possible that you may never even find the root cause. This causes us millions of dollars of loss and clearly frustrated developers. So that's why this is compared to finding a needle in a haystack. And that's why we have, this is what I was talking about. So that's why we've named the tool that Expedia we were trying to build as Haystack. Pretty much think of it as a diagnostic system that helps you find these needles in a faster way. Now, we didn't develop the science, the theory behind it. Google actually published a paper called Dapper, and in Dapper they talked about the basics of what to actually add on to your existing architecture in order to help find these needles or these root causes or these issues or these bugs in your system faster and easier. So it proposes you to add three things, three IDs on top of your basic trace logs. You're sending your data and then you're adding these three on top of it. The reason you're adding these is just to be able to identify things in a more granular fashion. So the first thing we add is the trace ID. The trace ID, or here as you can see, is T1. Think of this trace as something that involves three services, 1, 2, 3, and then comes back with a response to the consumer. All of this is identified by T1, trace ID. That identifies the trace. Spans, so service 1, 2, 3, they're all spans. Basically sub-services or sub-calls within this big transaction, they're all identified with their span ID or the message ID. So you're able to now identify the whole trace, all the spans inside it individually. But how do you know? So sometimes one service can call out 10 instances of the services below it, right? So how do you find out which instance now is the one that is affected? Hence, to establish that parent-child relationship, they proposed adding a parent message ID as well on top of it. So now you know the trace, the spans is the ID, and which instance of that span are we talking about. So kind of like a waterfall visually. And so the beauty of this concept of distributed tracing is that you're able to visualize all of this chaos that goes on in one singular transaction very easily in a waterfall-like manner. Okay, so we were not the first people to do this at Expedia. The first and the most popular one is Zipkin that does distributed tracing since 2014, if I'm not wrong. And it's definitely a market leader up until now. We have some paid tools for like X-Ray from AWS, Jaeger, and of course Haystack from Expedia. So why did we build Haystack? Because Zipkin was available in 2014. We could have just used that and added on top of it, which is what open source is about. But there were a couple of things that stopped us. We started our journey in 2014 with Zipkin doing a POC. We did our POC by forking Zipkin and trying it out in the Expedia ecosystem. One of the major big two things that stopped us was that there was no UUID support in Zipkin at that point. They do have it now, but they didn't have it at that time. And all of Expedia just talks in UUIDs. So that was a big no for us. And then the platform was not very extensible. And at Expedia, we had this vision that we really, really wanted to use this precious, valuable information in more ways than just one. And then of course, it didn't have auto tracing support at that time. And this all made us think that if we need it, probably there are other companies, other teams in the world that do require these things and might benefit from such a tool. So we went ahead and built it. So this is the basic architecture of Haystack. So pretty much Kafka is acting like a message bus. All the other components, apart from just tracing. So we used the concept of having a little bit more wholesome tool for diagnostics rather than just doing tracing. So we added a lot more components that we felt might be worth it. Some of them were actually mentioned in the Google Dapper paper as well. Like, how do you do trending for diagnostics? So you use just 3 parameters and that should be sufficient for you to trend and help diagnose anything, namely count, duration, success percentage. So similarly, we added a lot more things. Pipes, what if you want to send your data externally as well? We added, adaptive alerting because we felt like if there is some amount of early monitoring alerting that we can provide, we can bring you directly to the tool and it can create a more wholesome view to it. So a lot of those components were added as we went on. The other interesting component that is not here is because we just went in to open source yesterday with it, is the concept of using request response logs in addition to trace logs. So we at Expedia were doing a lot of conversations with the air giants such as Amadeus. All the third party was sending us data only in request responses, not in tracing logs. So we felt like a lot of our errors hid inside those logs. So we wanted to tap into it and add that as a component, which is currently in open source. We refer to it as blobs. So pretty much so Kafka is the message bus, but that is not the way we consume or ingest data. We do it through Kinesis because we have a really varied ecosystem. There's cloud stuff, data center, etc. And Kinesis at that time was the only one that supported that homogeneous mix. And then right at the top of that sits our agent, which is the one that helps consume data. It listens on a gRPC port constantly whenever a service needs to send data. It just takes it in, pushes into Kinesis, goes into Kafka, and then uses whichever component that service has deployed. So that brings me to the USPs of this. It's very, think of it as like a Docker-like design. All of these features are available to you, but the only thing that you really need to use is the traces component. All of those other things are just plug and play. So that's what makes it componentized. It's resilient because the only failure point here is Kafka, which really minimizes the failure risk. To say everything is not interlinked with each other, and hence it makes it a little bit more resilient than the other counterparts. The third thing is scalable. Again, the same reason, because it's all separated out, we're able to scale up one component by not touching the other components. So feature-wise, this is the list of our features, of course, including our recent addition blobs. Traces, trends, service graph, latency, alerts, pipes. Let's just visually have a look what these are. So traces is what I was talking about. Basically inside our system, in our database, Cassandra is what we use. All the rows are one transaction. All of them have a unique ID, which is the transaction ID as we talked about. That remains standard throughout the entire transaction. Hence all these rows that you see in here visually also represent the same. We've added and thrown in a lot more information on it. We've added a timeline view. We've added search criteria. A lot of, just basically we've tried to customize it for Expedia. And this is the waterfall view I was talking to you about. Look at how the first service which gets called is on top, and then there are those spans or the sub-services we talked about, all of which have a unique ID. That's why they're actually identifiable separately. At what time did they begin, end? The red shows that there was an error flag, true, that was returned. So in this case, there were 3 errors in the operation, but the route was still successful. So there are a lot of those combinations that can happen. It depends on how you design those traces, those microservices. But this gives you a really good idea on how that trace did, where the problem lies, and pretty much can do all of that visually rather than gripping your way through logs as we've been doing forever. The trends component, as I mentioned, was also mentioned in the DAP paper, and we had just kept count, duration, success percentage, and they basically tell you how all of your downstream calls or your operations are doing. So the next component is a service graph component. We've used Visceral from Netflix in here, so open source, and then basically, the red shows a certain level of threshold. At Expedia, we have a centralized place where each service has a different threshold, and they change their colors to warning and red depending on what they are sent. So this really visually gives you a great idea how your entire system is doing at a glance. You can obviously sort this, dig deeper. There are a lot of things that we've done on top of it. The other thing that we added, which was not mentioned in the dapper, was the latency cost. At Expedia, we were at this weird phase where some of our services were in cloud, some were not, some needed to be in the cloud, but it was just taking time. So a lot of the time, the errors were mostly latency. So for us to be able to find that out, we created a graph wherein you can see the average latencies. You can see the arrows are red when they actually change the data centers. Gives you the total network time, etc. Basically, at a glance, you should be able to see if the error was through the network latency or not. The alerts component. The alerts, again, something that we added as an early monitoring system. Our alerts were super basic. We were using thresholds at one time, and then we progressed to standard deviation, which was again not much of a progress in this machine learning world. So we actually started, our next steps were actually to have more of an adaptive kind of an alerting. So rather than the problem to actually happen and then for us to get to know, we've just fed our models. So we're trying an algorithm, the RNN one, but there are a lot of them that we're trying. Basically be able to use machine learning to do better alerting, because standard deviations were just not cutting it, even in a smaller ecosystem for Expedia. Just to give you a little bit of overview on how Haystack looks in Expedia Group currently. Expedia Group is a hood of 14 brands, a lot of which are already on this instance. We have more than 500 services on it. 500K per second span ingestion is our rate. It's so high because we have so much of shopping requests that we're taking in as well, even though we're sampling. It's just quite a bit. We have a huge clusters. You can see we use in Kubernetes as an orchestration. We use Kafka, Cassandra for our main database, and we use ES for doing those quick searches on top. We also support open tracing clients in Java, Node.js, Go, and Python. Python was again something that was contributed not from within Expedia, but from outside. Request response logs in open source, which is what I just mentioned, that we've just gone in with it. The key takeaways of this presentation or of our learnings through this process were that even though there is a lot of debate on this, that monitoring observability is just a fancy name, what encompasses what, it's no more a luxury, it's definitely a necessity. And it's not just trace logs, whatever more maximum you can monitor, it's just, it would just help us. Seconds, saving seconds in diagnostics can save us millions of dollars. So definitely a must to have. So something for everyone to check out. You can of course sample your log traces. Say if for Expedia we want to sample our shopping volume, but we want to keep 100% of the booking one, because of the priority. You can do that. That helps save costs quite a bit. So you can do that, but sometimes people don't wish to do it just because there are so many unique, interesting cases. Even in, there could just be a unique case pop up anytime. So then you need to rethink how you collect data or how you analyze it. In our case, we really needed trends for over a year. So we don't save per minute trends for a year. We save 5 minutes trends for a year. Per minute we save for a month. Per 5 seconds we save for a day. So there are things you can do basically to save that money as well. And a heterogeneous system such as Expedia definitely means much more work, much more investment initially. But because Expedia is there, I can tell you and I can speak on our behalf that standardizing the tracing practices or the tools all across have really helped us, really speed us up, and also in the future, the analysis, the data science on it, all of that then gets much easier, and you start to learn from these data as well. The other thing, which I also heard in the other presentations, was that people are welcoming contributions. We are actively looking for people to contribute to Haystack, not just in the open source community. If you really like it, you want to join us at the Expedia group, please get in touch with me. We are really looking for people who are extremely passionate on open source, and we've been contributing back a lot. We contributed back in Netflix Visceral. We've contributed with Zipkin, we collaborated with them. So we've done a lot of that, but anyone here interested, always welcome. These are our references if you guys want to take a picture of this. That's our top level repo in Expedia.com's open source repo. And then the second one is our documentation in the open source, and third is a way for you to reach us. Thank you so much everyone for being so patient, and question answers.
Are there cases where once you define that a certain span is much longer than it should, that you had difficulty finding actually why? And in which case, for example, a kernel level trace would have told you that it was preempted or something like that?
Right. So for us, we actually had a really interesting case a couple of months ago. We have a service called, which actually handles all of our lodging traffic. Sometimes one span, one trace, say I'm searching for hotels in Paris, they can be as fat as 50,000 sub-services in one transaction. And this is not just peak traffic, it can be more or less depending on that. For that, one of the things that we did, just to make sure that all the services or the entire system doesn't come down just because of a few of these, we did a couple of things. We put in a limit on the number of these spans, and currently that limit, say, is X for a certain team. That has really helped us in sampling not only at the transaction or the trace level, but also as a sub-service level. So that definitely is one thing. The other good thing that we did was, if there are services that we know are notorious for doing this, they just handle, it's just the nature of those traffic, that they peak, their peaks are really high and can disturb the rest of the traffic. We've separated out the way we consume that data. So we have separate Kinesis streams through which we consume that kind of spans. So any span that is above a certain limit or for a certain service, even if that goes extremely high, it doesn't bring down the entire system. So those are a few ways that we've applied. But yeah, that's definitely helped us at Expedia.
Yes, my question was not about the performance of Haystack, was about, do you need other tools? If something takes a long time and you can see that with Haystack, do you need other tools to diagnose what's happening during that long period of time? For example, kernel level traces that show you scheduling events or some things like that?
Yeah, so basically for us in Haystack, we've not been using that, but we have some teams that use tools like Datadog that does help in that process. We have certain brands that use it just because they have been facing those things. It's not something that we do at an Expedia level, but we do use Datadog, which does help in the same thing that you're talking about.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much.